All right, hey everybody. I am actually sharing screen. Yes, okay. So welcome again to the Open Game Day Open Office Hours. So as a reminder, Open Game Day Community is a NSF-funded research incubator bringing together a collective of researchers that are interested in the use of data generated in and around games to advance our scientific understanding of thinking, learning, and decision making. And we have two primary goals in this group. One is to compile a collection of resources and best practices that all of us use to do this kind of research. And then ultimately,